On that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to set Israel free. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had seen indeed a vision of angels who said that he was still alive." Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were walking, he walked ahead as if he was going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, he blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was walking with us along the road? He was opening the scriptures to us." That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. If you visit the Holy Land, you can walk the path that Jesus walked. You can stroll through Nazareth and imagine what it was like for Jesus to grow up there, then just a little village. When I was standing in a small olive grove in Nazareth, I could not help but imagine what it was like for Jesus to grow up there and to wonder what he was like as a little boy. When his friends got into a scuffle, was he always the peacemaker? Even as a child, did he stand up for those who were treated unfairly? You can drive to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, or Bethany, where he visited his good friends Mary and Martha. You can sail out on the Sea of Galilee and read the stories of Jesus calling those first fishermen to be his followers. Or you might imagine him standing on its banks of black basalt rock, preaching to the crowds who had flocked out to hear him. Meandering the streets of the old city, a variety of emotions may wash over you as you envision Jesus coming through that city gate to the shouts of "Deliver us!" Jesus toppling the tables of the money changers, gathering with his disciples in that upper room for the Last Supper. trudging through those serpentine corridors with that heavy cross beam on his back. If you travel to the land of Jesus, you can transport yourself back 2,000 years by just stepping into the Jordan River or by praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. You can visit Jericho and Capernaum and all the different sites that are named in the Gospels, but there's one that will always elude you: Emmaus. At least 3 different sites claim to be Emmaus, but there's no consensus on the location of this village mentioned in today's passage. By the way, the only time it's ever mentioned in Old or New Testaments. So why can Emmaus not be pinpointed? As we ponder the story, keep in mind that Luke was writing some 50 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. He didn't write his gospel as an historical account of the life and times of Jesus. Rather, he was writing for his specific community of faith, made up of second and third generation Christians. He penned it for people who never laid eyes on Jesus, but who had in some way experienced the risen Christ. We celebrated Easter morning 2 weeks ago, and last Sunday we pondered Easter evening. Today's story actually happens in between the two. It begins in the afternoon and then stretches into the evening. Luke says that 2 followers of Jesus were walking to Emmaus, attempting to make sense of the glorious and grim moments of the past few days. Jesus had made his triumphal entry into the holy city, and despite the presence of that Roman army, his followers boldly called on Jesus to save him and called him king. Their hopes skyrocketed as they envisioned the dawning of a new era, one in which corruption and violence were replaced by justice and peace. It must have been so thrilling for them that they couldn't sleep. But then very quickly their high hopes were shattered when Jesus was arrested, and their dreams were destroyed when he was hastily executed. In your mind's eye, can you picture these 2 followers of Jesus, their shoulders slumped, their feet dragging the dusty road as they moaned about these agonizing events? If you've ever suffered a very painful loss, you know how disorienting it can be. Initially, our bodies sort of buffer us from the severity of the pain by making it seem as if it's a little unreal. We hear ourselves saying things like, "I can't believe she's gone." Closely nipping at the heels of denial is anger. We bitterly denounce whoever or whatever is to blame for our suffering. It's not difficult to picture these 2 on the road cursing their religious leaders and political officials who executed their master and crushed their hopes. Were those leaders so intoxicated with their positions of power that they could not recognize Jesus as someone special from God? Were they so blinded by their own greed that they could not accept his message to care for the poor? I see these followers fluctuating between fury and denial. when some stranger comes along and begins walking beside them. It's the resurrected Christ. But for some reason, they don't recognize him. The text is intentionally vague. Jesus inquires about their animated discussion, and they stop abruptly. Their haggard faces make it obvious that they are stricken with grief. Then the one who is named Cleopas is incredulous. He says, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know what's happened in the past few days?" When we suffer a very serious loss, it's crucial that we begin to talk about it. Sharing our burden with another makes the load a little easier to bear than carrying that full load all alone. Jesus, ever the healer, encourages them to recite the details of the past week. Immediately, the story begins spilling out. They take turns telling it. Jesus was a prophet. He possessed extraordinary wisdom and incredible gifts. We believed he was the one to liberate Israel, but he was condemned and then he was crucified. They went on to talk about the bewildering events. Some women in our group astounded us. They went to the tomb early this morning and they say they found it empty. We're not so sure. They're skeptical of the story. And even if it were true, the two are so engulfed in their grief that they have no room for good news. They might have even thought that the Romans were playing one last cruel trick on them, snatching the body. Have you ever been so overwhelmed by darkness that it was nearly impossible to detect any light? As they continue to walk, Jesus delivers the quintessential Bible lesson, talking about all of the scriptures that point to him. Yet still the two, for some reason, cannot recognize who's walking along beside them. Eventually, the three arrive at their destination, Emmaus, but Jesus appears to be walking beyond it. They plead with him, saying, "Oh, please stay with us. It's getting dark. Let's have supper together." Jesus remains and joins them. At the table, he takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, he gives it to them, and what happens? Their eyes are opened. But the moment they identify him, he vanishes. The two are ecstatic. They talk about how their hearts were stirred when Jesus was illuminating those scriptures on the walk. Despite the fact that it is already evening and they plan to spend the night in Emmaus, they rush back to Jerusalem to tell the others. They find them and they begin explaining what happened to them on the road and how they finally recognized Jesus in breaking bread. I wonder, did anyone catch the name of the two people walking to Emmaus? One was Cleopas, but who was the other? Do you remember? You don't remember because Luke never names the second one. Why? One scholar says it's because the other one is you. Luke left a blank space for us to fill in our names. Sometimes when I'm just about to drift off to sleep at night, I wonder how many times during the day did I miss God's presence? Like my traveling companion, Cleopas, I may have been walking right next to God, but I was clueless to the divine presence. And why do you suppose Emmaus can't be pinpointed? Is it because the sands of time have long since wiped the place away or cleaned it from people's memories? Or is it because, as one scholar says, Emmaus is nowhere and Emmaus is everywhere? You see, Emmaus is not one specific piece of turf. It represents wherever people recognize the presence of God. Our sanctuary is Emmaus. The island of Iona is Emmaus. I've discovered Emmaus when visiting someone in a hospital. I've been to Emmaus when standing next to a coffin in a gravesite. Certain places and certain situations awaken us to the divine. When have you been to Emmaus? At the birth of a child? Standing on a mountaintop, singing Handel's Messiah? Absorbed in an intense prayer? Perhaps in a moment like the one mentioned in today's story, breaking bread with good friends. I think we often miss God because we expect to find God primarily in the mysterious and the miraculous. We look for God especially in the dramatic, life-changing events. But as Frederick Buechner reminds us, the sacred moments are often everyday moments. The moments which, if you do not look with more than your eyes or listen with more than your ears, reveal only some stranger walking down the road with us, or just a meal like any other meal. But if we look with our hearts, if we look with our imagination, we may just see Jesus himself. It's very rare for us to be aware of God's presence. However, Jesus made it crystal clear that if you feed someone who's hungry, if you visit someone who's ill or lonely, if you welcome someone who is a stranger, you are ministering to Jesus. When we pray, when we reconcile a broken relationship, when we love as Jesus loved, we draw very, very close to God. If your eyes are observant, your mind is alert, and your soul is expectant, you just might bump into Jesus. May it be so.